The 99th plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to an order. I now invite the attention of the Assembly to the President's letter dated 18 June 2026 on the proposal by the delegation of Cuba for a debate on Agenda Item 38 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Members will recall that the Assembly concluded its consideration on Agenda Item 38 at its 22nd plenary meeting on 29 October 2025 in order for the Assembly to consider the proposal for a debate on the item. It will be necessary to first reopen consideration of Agenda Item 38. At this stage, the Assembly is invited to consider only the reopening of the agenda item so that it can subsequently proceed to consider the proposal by the delegation of Cuba. I take it that it is the wish of the Assembly to reopen consideration of Agenda Item 38. It is so decided. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 38 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. As I mentioned earlier, I now invite the Assembly to consider the proposal by the delegation of Cuba. Members will recall that the Assembly held a debate on the item at its 21st and 22nd plenary meetings on 28 and 29 October 2025. Is there any objection to the proposal by the delegation of Cuba to hold an additional debate on agenda item 38? I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States objects to the General Assembly holding a second debate on this topic during the 80th session. Now, many of you in this room know me as the budget guy, so I could tell you how the $28,000 an hour we're spending today is wasteful. With the $84,000 this meeting will cost for 3 hours, and we all know it's going to go beyond 3 hours, we could feed 3,500 Cuban children for a month. We could provide emergency health kits for 40,000 people for 3 months. We could buy more than 1,600 solar lanterns for families sitting in the dark and wheel in thousands of sacks of rice, beans, and grain. We could even cover more than 400 years of the average Cuban's annual salary. But something far more dangerous than wasteful spending is happening here. Havana calls this meeting year after year, and now twice in one session, because it wants to make this assembly complicit in its machinery of repression. It wants the UN to buy it another propaganda clip. It wants to use your voices and your silence to show the world that a brutal communist dictatorship can keep polite company. It can enrich itself, starve its people, send dissidents to prison, exploit slave labor around the world, play the victim, and still get applause here in New York. Right now, Cuba is in darkness again. The island has been under a nationwide blackout since yesterday, and no doubt the regime will note that nearly 10 million people are affected. But wherever the few working generators are on the island, I can assure you that they are not powering the cells of political prisoners. They are not powering a Cuban family's refrigerators. They are not powering a hospital ward full of patients waiting on medicine, oxygen, or surgery. I urge the Cuban regime, turn the lights back on for your people. Because some of those generators are powering regime offices, they are powering Havana's propaganda shop. They are powering cronies watching this meeting right now, ready to clip it, post it, translate it, and spread their lies anywhere those lies can find harbor. That is why Havana wants this meeting. Not to solve its economic failures, not to save its people from hunger. Let's not kid ourselves, colleagues. Havana is here to manufacture content, and it will do that today not by helping Cubans or honestly highlighting their plight, but by blaming the United States. And while this assembly hands them another microphone, what are we not talking about? We are not talking about the more than 800 political prisoners held by the Cuban regime. Do they have electricity today? Fans in their cells? Phones? Outlets to charge them? Do their families have electricity to wait for one call that might come? Do they have light to read, write, pray, and survive? Or are they sitting in darkness while regime officials prepare talking points for New York?
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Colleagues, that is the real Cuban embargo.
Excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt the...
It is not the one that Havana pretends exists.
Excuse me. I'm sorry to interrupt the speaker. There is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. Before giving the floor, may I remind the representative of Cuba that, pursuant to Rule 71, a representative raising to a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I understand that at this time the General Assembly of the United Nations is considering whether it is to open a debate with regard to the issue, namely the necessity of ending the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. And at this time, as I understand it, the Assembly is simply going through a procedural item with regard to whether the debate is opened or whether it is not opened. I am surprised that the presidency of the General Assembly has not called to order the delegate of the United States of America, who is making a substantive intervention which in no way is procedural in nature. I really do request that you call the delegate to order. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States of America to continue.
Mr. President. And while this assembly hands them another microphone, what are we not talking about? We are not talking about the more than 800 political prisoners held by the Cuban regime. Do they have electricity today? Fans in their cells? Phones? Outlets to charge them? Do their families have electricity to wait for the one call that may come? Do they have light to read, write, pray, and survive? Or are they sitting in darkness while regime officials prepare talking points here in New York? Colleagues, that is the real Cuban embargo. It is not the one Havana pretends exists. It is the embargo the regime imposes on its own people, on speech, on faith, on enterprise, on dissent, on political rights and hope, and now, quite literally, on light. So ask yourselves, what exactly are we doing here? Will this meeting release Cuba's political prisoners? Will it return the stolen wages of Cuban doctors shipped abroad? Will it stop Gaesa from sitting on billions while Cuban families go hungry? The answer is no. It will give a brutal communist regime another clip, another post. Keep banging away. It's very effective. It will give a brutal communist regime another clip. Keep going, my friend. Another post, another propaganda splash.
I'm sorry to interrupt the Speaker from the United States. There is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. Once again, before giving the floor, may I remind the representative of Cuba that, pursuant to Rule 71, a representative raising to a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under consideration. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba on a point of order.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm surprised that Your Excellency is recalling to me what the rules of procedure of this General Assembly are. I'd like to ask you and the Secretariat about which basis are you taking from the rules of procedure of the General Assembly to proceed at this moment to allow a substantive debate without the General Assembly having agreed to open the debate? I'd like to remind you, President, that in adherence to the rules of procedure of the General Assembly, the General Assembly can only open and reopen the item necessity of ending the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. That is the issue. The only thing that we are discussing is whether we open this. The Assembly still has not decided whether or not they're going to have a debate on this. So I'd like you to explain to the Assembly exactly which rule of procedure you're basing yourself on as you are inadequately conducting this meeting with allowing the US to speak in this way. And I do object that this behavior continue. I'd like to ask, President, has the Assembly already agreed to hold the debate, or has it not yet approved opening the debate? If it has not yet approved it, then there should not be a debate until such time as it does. So I would like you to ask the General Assembly whether or not there should be a debate during this session on this item. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba, and also I would like to remind everyone that the United States is explaining their objection to the proposal. I now give the floor back to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. So ask yourselves, colleagues, what exactly are we doing here? Will this meeting release Cuba's political prisoners? Will it return the stolen wages of Cuban doctors shipped abroad? Will it stop Gaesa from sitting on billions while Cuban families go hungry? The answer is no. It will give a brutal communist regime another clip, another post, another propaganda splash. And this assembly should not be in that business, especially not during UN 80. We are supposed to be getting back this institution back to basics. This meeting does none of that. It does not deliver aid. It does not defend human rights. It does not help the Cuban people. The Cuban regime already gets one annual whitewashing spectacle in this body. One was already too many. Two, helps validate the critics who see this body as fundamentally unserious. So the United States calls for a vote on whether to proceed. We urge delegations to vote no. Stand with the Cuban people, not with the regime that oppresses them. I thank you.
The representative of the United States of America has raised an objection to the proposal to hold an additional debate on agenda item 38. I shall now put a recorded vote the proposal by the delegation of Cuba to hold an additional debate on agenda item 38. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in I give the floor to the representative of Cuba on a point of order.
Sí, gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pursuant to Rule 88, I'd like to confirm with you what you just sort of said. You said voting in favor, so voting yes, voting green, means supporting the holding of the debate now. On the basis of that, I ask delegations to vote in favor so that the debate can take place now, bearing in mind the urgency of the suffering caused to our people by the energy siege and the embargo imposed by the United States. I ask delegations to vote in favor of holding the debate now. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Cuba. Those in favor of the proposal by Cuba should vote yes. Those against the proposal by Cuba should vote no. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of the proposal by the delegation of Cuba to hold an additional debate on agenda item 38, please signify. Those against and abstentions.
The Assembly is now voting on the proposal by the delegation of Cuba to hold an additional debate on agenda item 38. As the President stated, those in favor of the proposal by Cuba should vote yes. Those against the proposal by Cuba should vote no. Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 136, against 9, abstention 30. The proposal to hold an additional debate on agenda item 38 is adopted. Before proceeding further, as agreed at the General Committee meeting of 18 May 2026 and announced in the President's letter dated 20 May 2026, it had been proposed that the time limits for the statements in the debate on this item be 5 minutes for individual delegations speaking in their national capacity and 7 minutes for statements made on behalf of a group of states. The delegation of Cuba has informed the President of its objection to this proposal. Accordingly, no speaking time limit will be applied to the debate on this item. I would like to propose that the list of speakers for the debate on this item be closed in view of the large number of delegations inscribed on the list. Unless I hear any objection, I will take it that the Assembly agrees to close the list of speakers. It is so decided. I now give the floor to His Excellency Borno Eduardo Fernandez Varela, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, Excellencies, permanent representatives, distinguished delegates. The government of the United States is carrying out against Cuba a multi-dimensional, non-conventional warfare that has already lasted for almost 7 decades now and has become ever more cruel and more ruthless during the last 7 months. Added to this, there is now an energy siege, which is equivalent to a naval blockade, which is an act of war. Cuba's access to fuel supplies, both for commercial and humanitarian purposes, are being hindered by means of direct threats, unilateral coercive actions, and even harassment or intimidation of oil tankers by US military naval assets. Threats of a military aggression have been repeatedly launched by top officials of the US administration, and several public sources have referred to warlike options and preparations. Added to the economic, commercial and financial blockade, there are unprecedented actions of an extreme extraterritorial nature, such as the implementation, use of secondary sanctions, which pursue the macabre purpose of provoking in Cuba a humanitarian crisis and the complete destabilization of the country, which would pave the way for, or forcefully urge, an imperialist military intervention that would provoke a bloodbath and numerous Cuban and American deadly casualties. When asked if economic pressures against Cuba would continue to intensify, President Donald Trump himself answered, and I quote, "I don't think you can have much more pressure other than going in and destroying the place." In the last few months, the humanitarian damage to our population has intensified, which has led to a worsening in the quality of life, the reduction of the means of subsistence, the limitation to the potential of the personal, family and social development, the massive, flagrant and systematic violation of the human rights of an entire people in an act of collective punishment. All of these highly important and urgent matters deserve not only the attention, but also the clearest statement by the United Nations and its most universal and representative body, which is the General Assembly, by virtue of its mandate to preserve international peace and security and ensure the enjoyment of human rights. Cuban families, particularly children and young people and mothers, continue to suffer, suffering caused by long-lasting and hard-to-endure blackouts. Often, when there is a power outage, there is also a lack of water. People know about the anguish over the shortage of a particular medication to treat a family member, food scarcities, or the high prices of staple goods are weighing heavily on the people. The country's infant mortality rate of 4.0 per 1,000 live births has increased to 9.9. This means that there are preventable deaths which, under different conditions, would not have occurred if there had been equipment, devices and therapies. 1,780 newly born could have been saved. The number of persons dying of cancer has significantly increased. In the case of children and young people, the survival rate decreased from 85 to 65%. The trend coincides with the toughest moments of the US siege. The blockade asphyxiates and kills silently. Paying attention to this ruthless crime is also a responsibility of the United Nations. The US government, and in particular its State Department, is spreading the lie that the blockade is not aimed against the Cuban people, but only against the government. Well, ask the people of Cuba whether or not they are suffering because of the blockade. You may even want to ask diplomats, correspondents, and other foreign citizens living in Cuba. We've heard an abuse of, in the abuse of the procedural part of the meeting, the abusive comments of the United States. No reference was made to any of these subjects that I have mentioned, and it's no surprise because he represents a government that is responsible for the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a government responsible for dozens of military interventions and the support of the most brutal military dictators in Latin America and other regions. It is a government that is complicit in the genocide occurring in Gaza, of repression in universities against teachers and students protesting about the situation. It is the government of the militarization of cities for political reasons, of the brutal repression of immigrants, the police hunting of those immigrants, the separation of small children from their parents. It's hardly a surprise because the delegate is representing the government that is responsible for dozens of extrajudicial executions in the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Caribbean on the pretext of fighting international crimes with no evidence. It is the authorities that are responsible for the police brutality against demonstrators in this country and the growing number of deaths in detention. He represents the government responsible for the existence of a racial profiling which discriminates significantly, brutally against minorities, particularly those of African American and Hispanic descent. The highest prison population, a massive prison population, highest on the planet, a penitentiary system that is based on racial profiling. He also represents a government that pays lower wages to women for the same work. I was surprised that the General Assembly rules were not respected, and that we had to hear what we did before the General Assembly decided to hear the debate. I don't know whether we'll be hearing another speech from the United States, who strangely was the first speaker on the list, despite the fact that that he had objected to this debate taking place. This cynicism is what we're talking about. It's fundamental here. A substantive statement was delivered, full of old lies to try to remove the ability of the General Assembly to debate this very issue. The one that abused the rules of procedure to make substantive allegations, slanderous allegations, were saying in that same intervention that this debate should not take place, trying to remove from the General Assembly the ability to decide whether we discuss this, trying to censure the Assembly, which might be possible somewhere else, but not in this august forum. I don't know whether we will be hearing again in this session the old argument, well-used argument of the United States, according to which the fuel siege against Cuba does not exist, that the blockade is a mere justification of the Cuban government for its problems, that the US is only exercising the right to refuse to trade with Cuba and applying a simple bilateral embargo. That is a fallacy that does not stand up to the slightest scrutiny, that contradicts the actions, the cowardly actions of the US government with regard to Cuba and with regard to all states that you represent here. It is a lie, and nobody believes it except the delegate who spoke, who has either a minimum of information or perhaps lacks decency. Both could be true. The damages caused by the blockade, and I'm going to quote some figures, the damages caused by the blockade between March 1st, 2025 and February 28th, 2026, at current prices, amount to the record figure of $8.083 billion, which represents a 7% increase over last year. The cumulative impact of the blockade since it was first imposed amounts to $178.7 billion at current prices. And of course, you can't include in those figures the extreme impact of the total blockade on the provision of fuel to Cuba that began in February. These impacts are essentially the result of extraterritorial coercive actions that violate the rules of international law, international trade, and freedom of navigation, and also infringe upon the sovereign prerogatives of independent states that you represent, and their right to have relations with Cuba according to their own interests and laws. Added to the brutal energy siege, there are other measures that have been imposed in the course of this year with an identical purpose, since they are intended to force sovereign governments to comply with the illegitimate prohibitions imposed by the United States on their trade with Cuba. The government of the United States imposes on sovereign states and governments and companies that they abandon their relationship with Cuba, not because of a business disadvantage and not because of a mandate of their governments either, but because this is being dictated by a foreign government, in this case the government of the United States, which does not have jurisdiction or power over the activity of commerce beyond its borders. Cuba, as a free and independent and sovereign state, rejects another country dictating the way in which we should govern and the economic model that we should follow and the foreign relations that we should have with others. Probably, if the United States is going to repeat their intervention, what we will hear is the fallacious arguments so often used by the government of the United States, and which we got a flavor of from the delegate, to justify the crime of genocide. They will allegate as supposed evidence figures of selective figures from the United States where the rules universally accepted of trade and freedom of navigation have not been respected, and which are now focusing almost exclusively on the private sector, which is also limited in terms of the US's counterparts in trade. These things do not in any way contribute to resolving the main problems that are caused by the shortages that our people suffer. They don't help because the US delegation does not allow us to resume electric power generation or drinking water production. They don't allow us to improve our public transport or ensure hospital services, to benefit education, or help us to protect food supplies for the most vulnerable sectors of the population. The US delegation did not mention that the government of the US offered humanitarian assistance accepted weeks ago by the government of Cuba, but which has been deferred and restricted for political purposes. They didn't refer either to the fact that the US delegation to the World Food Programme was isolated in a vote in their attempt to block a food assistance program to Cuba worth $116 million. The US will repeat and repeat again as an attempted justification that Cuba is allegedly incompetent. Any of the delegates present here might wonder with good reason how it's possible to accuse the government of Cuba of the things that the US is suggesting when the US is applying a genocidal blockade, and that this economic aggression has lasted now for almost 70 years. But despite this, we have developed a huge social and human development network. And how could they blame the Cuban government for the consequences of being deprived completely of fuels and other essential supplies over the last 7 months? How could they not recognize that despite this, Cuba has not lost stability? There is not a major humanitarian crisis, and we have not ceased, and we will never cease to abandon to defend our people. We are relieved and encouraged by collective solidarity, the participation and the efforts of all, particularly women and young people, in communities in a search for solutions, and the intensive and tireless work of the party, the state, the government, the local bodies of the People's Power organizations, and the representatives of the people and the civil society organizations. They give our people hope. They give our sovereign people hope. And the profound economic and social transformations recently adopted by our National Assembly will help to adapt Cuba's socialist model to the tough realities. These things give us hope. We will continue to fight the brutal aggression of the United States. We appreciate the broad international support and cooperation from numerous governments, parliaments, political forces, organizations, solidarity movements, and associations of Cubans residing abroad. The hostility and threats that Cuba faces today are part of a worrying sequence of violations of international law and are a prelude of what might happen to any other country tomorrow. We need to ask ourselves in this assembly whether this is the new world order that we're moving towards. We need to stop and think about whether this supposed order would be consistent with the founding principles of this organization, and whether this is the path that will safeguard international peace and security, and which will promote understanding between equally sovereign states, and whether this will promote cooperation, trade, development, and respect for human rights. It is indispensable to prevent this behavior characterized by domination, plundering, occupation, dispossession, and cognitive warfare from becoming part of an international order that is even worse than the one that we've seen in recent decades. It is essential to defend the founding values of the United Nations, international law, and the UN Charter, and assert the promise of safeguarding present and future generations from the scourge of war. There have been bilateral diplomatic talks that were proposed by the government of the United States and that Cuba accepted, in line with our tradition and our foreign policy principles, with the honest and constructive intention of finding a solution to bilateral differences. However, there has not been any progress, and it's difficult that there might be any if the expectations amongst those who conduct it in Washington are to treat Cuba as a vanquished or conquered adversary, as a colonial possession or a domain over which the US has jurisdiction and authority. The numbers confirm that this aggressive behavior does not represent the interests of the majority of US citizens. According to a study that was finalized yesterday, 98.3% of publications and comments on digital networks in the United States do not support the energy siege, do not support the blockade, do not support aggression against Cuba. This genocidal criminal policy is simply caters to the anti-Cuban and revanchist whims of a tiny but powerful and influential segment based particularly in South Florida, but which has proved that it has the capacity to manipulate the political system of the United States and guide the behavior of the current government. I don't know whether the US delegation within the next few minutes will repeat the ridiculous argument that Cuba represents a threat to the national security of the mightiest, most aggressive nuclear military power on the planet, aggressive and predatory, aimed at imposing peace through strength. There has been no statement by the Cuban government, no evidence, nor the slightest hint indicating that Cuba has intended to threaten the United States. It is not possible to identify any activity whatsoever in Cuba that may jeopardize the national security, the well-being of the citizens, or the competitiveness of the economy of this neighborly, powerful country. Cuba is not a threat. The blockade is. Cuba is the nation that is under threat. But we are a nation committed to the defense of peace, international law, multilateralism, truth, and justice. A people that for more than 150 years have been struggling for their freedom and independence, that have written pages of glory, standing strong against all sorts of onslaughts, and shall defend their independence and sovereignty to the bitter end. In the year of the centennial birthday of the historical leader of the Cuban Revolution, Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro Ruz, and faithful to his legacy, our determination will always be homeland or death, we shall overcome. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Vladimir Kolotsev, Minister of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, most of us this morning turned on the lights and put the kettle on without giving it a second thought. We take having electricity for granted. Now imagine that same ordinary day in Cuba. You wake up, there's no electricity, there is no water because the pumps have stopped working, the food in the fridge has gone bad, public transport isn't running, and the nearest hospital has switched to emergency generators. For millions of Cubans, this is the tragic reality. The United Nations system confirms these findings. According to expert assessments, 4.2 million people in Cuba require humanitarian assistance. In some parts of the country, power outages last for 2 or even 3 days. Millions of people are experiencing interruptions in the water supply. Tens of thousands of children aren't able to get vaccinations on time. And humanitarian supplies that have already reached the island can't be distributed because of fuel shortages. At first glance, these may appear to be different problems, but they all have a common nature. And they arise not because there's no country that's not providing fuel. They arise because extraterritorial unilateral restrictive measures make it possible to obstruct deliveries even between two sovereign states. That is why ensuring Cuba's full fuel supply today is no longer a matter of trade. It is a humanitarian issue. The blockade of Cuba is a striking example of illegitimate unilateral measures of intimidation and punishment against governments deemed undesirable being elevated to the level of official state policy by Washington. This is a policy that the international community has consistently responded to with a firm no. We would emphasize that General Assembly resolutions expressing the solidarity of the global community with the legitimate demands of the Cuban people have been adopted by an overwhelming majority of United Nations member states for more than 30 years, since 1992. We regret that the convening of this General Assembly session encountered the strongest possible opposition, including intense pressure exerted on foreign partners to prevent them from supporting Havana's initiative. The USA is trying to accuse the Cuban leadership of anything under the sun just to justify the legitimacy of their unilateral coercive restrictions and their threats of force against the island of freedom. The American blockade of Cuba is nothing other than one of the methods used to establish control over that territory in an attempt to revive the Monroe Doctrine. Let's once again talk through what the United States embargo against Cuba means in practice. It is a sweeping prohibition on trade with the island for US companies and private individuals, a ban on Cuban imports into the US, restrictions on dollar transactions, prohibitions on US citizens and tourist travel to the island, and most importantly, the right enshrined in US legislation to apply extraterritorial unilateral sanctions and punitive measures against third countries if they cooperate with Cuba, thereby creating a deterrence effect for foreign investors. The Cuban people have lived under this pressure for almost 70 years. The result is that the blockade imposes enormous economic costs, hampers the implementation of socio-economic reforms, and deprives the country of access to modern technologies, energy resources, and investment. These long-standing, illegitimate sanctions measures are preventing the full normal functioning of the national financial system and preventing local economic operators from making full use of international financial markets and the relevant development institutions. Significant and unjustified harm is being dealt to the welfare and health of ordinary people, while social tensions are being exacerbated. While hiding behind lofty rhetoric about allegedly caring for the well-being of the island's population, the United States is de facto carrying out a cynical strategy aimed at overthrowing an undesirable political system without regard for the unbearable hardship and suffering inflicted on millions of Cuban citizens. It's obvious to everyone that since in January of this year the White House imposed a fuel blockade on the island, supplies of hydrocarbons have virtually ceased. The only exception was the Russian tanker Anatoly Kolodkin, which delivered on the 31st of March 100,000 tons of crude oil to Cuba in the form of humanitarian assistance. In these circumstances, and amid increased seasonal demand for electricity, the daily power generation shortfall has reached 2,100 to 2,200 megawatts. Rolling blackouts have become the norm, and in some regions they last up to 30 hours. Another painful blow has been the US restrictions imposed on Cuba's tourism and mining sectors. This has compelled a number of major foreign investors, including Spain and Canada, to leave the Cuban market altogether or to drastically reduce their presence under the threat of Washington's secondary sanctions. In these circumstances, it is clear that attempting to place the blame for the current situation on the island on the alleged political miscalculations of the authorities while ignoring the suffering of millions of ordinary citizens does a serious disservice to the Cuban people. This approach is contrary to the norms of humanitarian law and common human morality. This is not about the failures of the government. Rather, it is about the cruelty of the blockade. The fact remains that no government without the solidarity and support of its own people, could have remained in power for so many years under the harshest, illegitimate measures imposed by hostile external forces. As a result of the US embargo, Cuba is facing a critical situation. According to expert assessments, in the first quarter of 2026, compared with the corresponding period of 2025, GDP declined by approximately 20 to 24%. By comparison, even in 1993, the worst year for the economy and the worst year of the so-called special period in peacetime, that indicator fell by 15%. Inflation from January to March of this year hit 13%, while agricultural prices increased by 31%. Infant mortality has risen sharply from 4 per 1,000 live births in 2017 to 9.9 today. Cuba's national vaccination program is at risk of disruption. The population has essentially been deprived of the ability to store and prepare food. Access to drinking water is limited and public transport has been paralyzed. Bread distributed through the rationing system has been cut by half and is now supplied intermittently, and the individual allocation has been reduced from 80 grams to 60 grams per person. And this for us is a very telling statistic. During the siege of Leningrad, at the lowest point of that bread ration was 125 grams per person. We understand that the Cuban ration basket includes more than just bread. Nevertheless, the figures all do speak for themselves. The dramatic developments surrounding the island of freedom require a clear and appropriate response from the global community. Cuba must be guaranteed the opportunity to receive the assistance it needs, including humanitarian assistance, without any political conditions attached. We hope that ultimately the United States will adopt a humane approach to resolving the current situation. At the same time, it is noteworthy that the Cuban economy is showing remarkable resilience in the face of unprecedented pressure from the United States. In June, the government of Cuba announced the most extensive package of economic liberalization reforms undertaken on the island in the past 15 years. That package includes 176 measures. The authorities carefully took into account expert proposals and public opinion regarding the transformation of the country's economic and social model. The inhumane restrictions imposed from outside on the economic stability and social well-being of a sovereign country are unacceptable in today's world. Unilateral coercive measures that run counter to the UN Charter not only restrict the Cuban people's right to determine freely and independently their own political, economic, and social systems, they also undermine collective efforts by the international community to address global challenges, including ensuring food and energy security and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Problems in relations between states can and should be resolved through negotiations based on mutual respect. Washington justifies maintaining and tightening its sanctions by claiming that Cuba allegedly poses a threat. But if fuel is intended to keep power plants, hospitals, and water supply systems operating, then who exactly are they threatening? The undisguised desire of the United States to sink the island goes beyond the bounds of generally accepted norms of civilized conduct, civilized engagement. We call upon Washington to immediately lift all illegal unilateral restrictive measures, to remove Cuba from the arbitrary U.S. list of alleged state sponsors of terrorism, and also for all states to strictly comply with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations in their entirety and interrelationship. The Island of Freedom deserves nothing but respect for its sovereignty and for the right of its people to determine their own future. The response that the international community gives today will determine whether the actions of the United States against Cuba remain a dangerous exception or whether they become a new norm in international relations and will be applied to other countries. Russia does not limit itself to political support alone. It consistently provides practical humanitarian assistance to the Cuban people. Cuba has traditionally been among the priority recipients of Russian humanitarian assistance, including through international organizations. The principal multilateral channel for providing food assistance to those in need in the country is the United Nations World Food Programme. Between 2018 and 2025, the Russian Federation contributed to the WFP fund for the implementation of humanitarian projects in Cuba to the amount of $18 million, and in 2026, $2 million is allocated. In addition to providing direct food assistance, Russia finances long-term projects aimed at strengthening the country's resilience. From 2021 to 2025, a World Food Programme project was financed to develop a sustainable school feeding system in Cuba with a total budget of $5 million. Despite the obstacles being created from outside, this assistance work continues. According to the Russian Ministry for Emergency Situations, a shipment of humanitarian cargo consisting of 211 tons of sunflower oil fortified with vitamins A and D, intended for delivery to the port of Santiago de Cuba, has been temporarily delayed in Venezuela. Nevertheless, it does remain part of the ongoing program of support for the Cuban population. We reaffirm our solidarity with the people and government of brotherly Cuba, with whom we will continue to strengthen close bonds of friendship, mutual support, assistance, and comprehensive cooperation. Everyone knows that attempts to bring the Cuban people to their knees have always been doomed to failure. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the Minister of Internal Affairs of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay on behalf of the Group of 77 and China.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Group of 77 and China on Agenda Item 38, entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. We thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this timely and important debate. The Group regrets that the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States on Cuba for more than 6 decades remain in full application and continues to be enforced. We regret the measures undertaken recently and during the current year aim at reinforcing the embargo on Cuba, which represents the main obstacle to the process of achieving normalized relations between the two countries. The direct and indirect damage is enormous. It affects all the critical sectors of the Cuban economy, including public health, nutrition, and agriculture, as well as trade, investment, tourism, and banking. We are deeply concerned about the widening of the extraterritorial nature of the embargo on Cuba, notably through the full implementation of Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. The application of this law is a clear transgression to the freedom of commerce among nations because of its intimidating purpose by punishing any trade or investment transactions between any given country and Cuba. Regarding the announcement by the government of the United States of new measures further tightening the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed against the Republic of Cuba, including actions aimed at obstructing the supply of oil to the country and the imposition of sanctions on third states that engage in legitimate commercial relations with Cuba, which have clear extraterritorial effects, the Group stresses that these measures are contrary to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, and undermine multilateralism, international economic cooperation, and the rules-based, non-discriminatory, open, fair, and equitable multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization at its core. At the same time, they aggravate Cuba's difficulties to carry out financial and commercial operations, threatening the livelihood and integrity of the Cuban population. The Group of 77 and China is deeply concerned about the severe humanitarian and development consequences that restrictions affecting access to energy supplies have on Cuba currently. Energy shortages and disruptions in fuel supplies are undermining electricity generation and the provision of essential public services, affecting hospitals, schools, water and sanitation systems, public transportation, food production and distribution networks, and other critical infrastructure. The group is also concerned that financial restrictions and obstacles to international banking transactions have hindered the acquisition of renewable energy technologies, humanitarian supplies, and other goods essential for the people of Cuba at this difficult juncture. In the same vein, we urge the immediate removal of Cuba from the U.S. Department of State's list of countries that are allegedly sponsors of terrorism. Cuba is a long-standing active partner of members of the group in promoting South-South cooperation. Thanks to the efforts made by Cuba, many countries within the group have developed their scientific and technical potential. All we know about Cuba is friendship and solidarity. We know nothing about terrorism. The group recognizes the long-standing and positive contribution of the Cuban international medical cooperation and solidarity in saving the lives of millions of people around the world, particularly but not exclusively in developing countries. Cuba has extensively and consistently contributed to the international community for many decades. Its assistance to other countries has been a great example of South-South cooperation. The group therefore rejects any unilateral coercive measure that are not in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations, or attempts to hinder this international medical cooperation and solidarity for political or any other reasons. Mr. President, in this context, the group reiterates that there can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. We continue to be guided by all the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter and by the full respect for the principles of international law, particularly regarding the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention and non-interference in states' internal affairs, and freedom of international trade and navigation. We recall the states shall refrain in international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The group emphasizes that these principles must be fully respected and stresses the need to refrain from any action inconsistent with the Charter that could aggravate tensions or jeopardize the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Cuba. In this regard, the group calls for all differences to be addressed through peaceful means and dialogue, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. We believe that it is the duty and responsibility of every member state to strictly comply with those principles, and that any policy or action that disregards them should be immediately repealed. The group therefore calls for the immediate, complete, and unconditional lifting of the embargo, including all measures with extraterritorial effects. Ending these restrictions is essential, not only for Cuba's development and the well-being of its people, but also for upholding the Charter, international law, and the credibility of multilateralism. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uruguay, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, comprising Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos PDR, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Timor-Leste, and Vietnam. The ASEAN member states thank the Foreign Minister of Cuba for the update on the latest developments. ASEAN has consistently supported the General Assembly's annual consideration of this agenda item. The long-standing support of ASEAN for the resolution entitled, and I quote, "Necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against the Republic of Cuba," reflects our shared commitment to the principles of the United Nations Charter, in particular the sovereign equality of states, non-interference, non-intervention, and the peaceful settlement of disputes, which are principles that remain the foundation of the multilateral system that all states have an abiding interest in upholding. Mr. President, ASEAN remains concerned about the deep impact of the present situation on the Cuban people, including on their access to food, medicines, and other essential supplies. It is fundamentally the well-being of ordinary Cubans that lies at the heart of our shared concern. We are particularly concerned that recent actions have led to a deteriorating situation for ordinary Cubans, and we underline the need to remove the measures which have led to the current situation. The restrictions on fuel exports to Cuba have also aggravated the country's ongoing energy crisis and hampered its ability to deal more effectively with the region's climate-related natural disasters. ASEAN remains firmly convinced that differences between states are best addressed through dialogue and engagement, underpinned by mutual respect. In this spirit, we strongly encourage both sides to pursue open and constructive engagement with a view to resolving their differences peacefully. In this constructive spirit, ASEAN joins other members of this Assembly in reiterating our call for the United States to lift its unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba as soon as possible, and to delist Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. We look forward to continue engaging on this matter when the Assembly considers the item at its forthcoming session. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 121 member states of the Non-Aligned Movement during the plenary meeting and agenda item 38, and namely necessity of ending the economic, commercial, financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba. At the onset, I would like to acknowledge the presence of HE Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. The General Assembly has expressed its overwhelming support for and solidarity with the people and government of Cuba through its principled position in favor of the lifting of the embargo imposed against this sovereign country by the United States of America. Last October, the overwhelming majority of member states of this organization voted in favor of the resolution A/RES/80/4. Regrettably, despite this clear and repeated mandate of the General Assembly, the Non-Aligned Movement has viewed the strengthening of the embargo against Cuba in the recent months as a serious setback to the process of normalization of bilateral relations between the two countries. Mr. President, The non-aligned movement expresses its deep concern regarding the recent announcement by the government of the United States of new measures which tighten to unprecedented and extreme levels the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed against the Republic of Cuba, including actions aimed at obstructing the supply of oil to the country, sanctioning third states that maintain legitimate commercial relations with Cuba, and the implementation of secondary sanctions against companies, banks, and foreign entities, even if their businesses in the United States are not related to Cuba. Such measures, which multiplies the extraterritorial effects of the blockade, adversely impact not only Cuba and its people, but also third states and international economic relations, and constitute a flagrant violation of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, international law, multilateral trading system, as well as the norms and the principles governing friendly relations among states. The non-aligned movement is deeply concerned about the significant and growing humanitarian harm and enormous damage caused by the latest unilateral coercive measures against the Cuban people, as well as their devastating effects on all critical sectors of the Cuban economy, including public health, education system, electricity supply, nutrition, agriculture, trade, and the daily lives of Cuban citizens. The recent disruption of fuel supplies to Cuba has generated serious consequences for electricity generation and the functioning of essential public services. Prolonged power outages have affected hospitals, schools, water distribution systems, and food preservation facilities. Public transportation services have experienced significant disruptions, while agriculture production and food distribution networks have been severely impacted. Alarmingly, Cuba has received only one oil tanker during the last 7 months. In this period, more than 40 foreign banks have refused to conduct business with Cuba, while over 140 international bank transfers have been blocked, including many related to payments for the acquisition of solar and wind energy technologies. The humanitarian consequences are particularly evident in the health sector. More than 100,000 patients are currently awaiting surgical procedures that have been postponed, including approximately 12,000 children. The non-aligned movement is gravely concerned by these developments. Mr. President, the movement once again reiterates its call to the government of the United States of America to put an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba that constitutes the major impediment for its full development, and to eliminate the additional unilateral measures imposed since 2017, including the unilateral and arbitrary designation of Cuba as state sponsor of terrorism, which strengthened the embargo and caused huge material losses and economic damage to the Cuban people. The non-aligned movement, while acknowledging that Cuba poses no threat to international peace and security, underscores the positive contribution of Cuban International Medical Corporation and solidarity to saving lives of millions of people in the world, and its efforts to promote international and regional peace. Guided by the Bandung principles, particularly the respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, and the refraining from acts or threats of aggression or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any country, the non-aligned movement urges the General Assembly, as the most representative body of the United Nations, to mobilize efforts to prevent a military aggression against Cuba, a founding member of our movement, and to preserve peace. In this regard, and in line with the principles enshrined in the Declaration of the Purposes and the principles of the role of the non-aligned movement in the present international juncture adopted in the 14th NAM Summit in Havana, we reiterate that all countries must refrain from exerting pressure or coercion on other countries, including resorting to aggression or other acts involving the use of direct or indirect force and the application and/or promotion of any coercive unilateral measure that goes against international law or in any way incompatible with it for the purpose of coercing any other state to subordinate its sovereign rights and to gain any benefit whatsoever. Mr. President, in conclusion, the non-aligned movement, while reiterating its commitment to the promotion, preservation, and strengthening of multilateralism, reaffirms that the full respect of the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, particularly those referring to sovereign equality, non-interference, prohibition of the use of force or threat of force, and non-intervention, is critical for the effective maintenance of international peace and security. Therefore, the international community must continue working together on the reversal and elimination of the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, given inter alia its illegal character and its extraterritorial implications, and to avoid any further escalation against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence, and self-determination of the Republic of Cuba. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uganda. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea on behalf of the group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations.
Mr. President, I have the honor to take the floor on behalf of the group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations. Since we met last October, the unjust and abusive blockade against Cuba has been extremely and unprecedentedly tightened, which is having a severe humanitarian impact on the lives of the Cuban people, compounded by the frequent and systematic threat of the use of force against the country. We call upon the international community to speak clearly in favor of peace, to prevent a military aggression against Cuba, and to reiterate the need to end immediately the blockade. This is one of the most serious, prolonged, and systematic violations of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. It goes not only against the purposes and principles of this organization, but also against international human rights law, as the blockade is a form of collective punishment on the Cuban population. In line with our historic and principled positions, we express our unwavering solidarity with the people and the government of the Republic of Cuba. We strongly condemn the adoption of additional extreme measures by the U.S. government aimed at further tightening the blockade through actions intended to obstruct the supply of oil of the country and to penalize legitimate economic and commercial relations between Cuba and third states. Such actions based on narrative built upon falsehood intended to present the Republic of Cuba as a threat that it does not represent, seek to deliberately asphyxiate the Cuban economy to inflict additional suffering on the Cuban people. These measures are clearly intended to aggravate in a deliberate manner the living conditions of the population and to deprive the Republic of Cuba of essential resources, including energy supplies vital for economic activity and social well-being. The energy blockade on Cuba is equivalent in its effects to a naval blockade. It constitutes an act of genocide by subjecting the Cuban population to conditions that threaten the integrity and existence. Cuba has reportedly received only one oil tanker during the last 6 months, contributing to a deep energy crisis that has affected the entire country. The humanitarian impact on the health sector is particularly troubling. Reports indicate that survival rates among children diagnosed with cancer have declined from approximately 85% to 65%. Infant mortality has increased from approximately 4 deaths per 1,000 live births to 9.9 per 1,000 live births. In addition, the health system faces challenges of ensuring essential services for 30,000 pregnant women, 60,000 patients undergoing radiotherapy, and 2,888 patients dependent on hemodialysis treatments, all of which require a stable supply of electricity. The group also denounces the dishonest campaign unleashed by the government of the United States of America to discredit Cuban International Medical Corporation and to exert pressure on recipients' governments, particularly on those from developing countries, thereby diminishing the commendable work undertaken by Cuban medical personnel in saving lives around the world, as demonstrated, among others, during the worst part of the COVID-19 pandemic. In this context, we express our deep appreciation, gratitude, and recognition to the Cuban health professionals who have provided high-quality care to millions of people around the world, while calling on the U.S. government to put an end to their coercive, hostile, and blackmail practices and policies. Mr. President, the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the defense, preservation, and full implementation of the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, in their entirety and the interconnectedness, including sovereign equality of states, the prohibition of the threat or use of force, non-intervention in the internal state affairs of states, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and the right of peoples to self-determination. A small state such as Cuba cannot possibly constitute a threat to any other country and has consistently advocated peaceful coexistence, sovereign equality, and dialogue among states. Threats against Cuba's sovereignty, including statements suggesting the possibility of military action, raise serious questions under the Charter of the United Nations, including the principles of sovereign equality, non-intervention, and the prohibition of the threat or use of force. In this regard, we caution against any adventurism aimed at fabricating pretexts for intervention in the domestic affairs of the Republic of Cuba, or for the threat or use of force against the country, and highlight in this context the responsibility of the international community as a whole and the United Nations unequivocally condemn these irresponsible and illegal acts. A military attack against the country would entail extremely grave humanitarian consequences for its population and for the Latin American and Caribbean region, with a dangerous destabilizing effect contrary to its status as a zone of peace. We further underscore that differences among states, regardless of their political, economic, or social systems, must be addressed through dialogue, diplomacy, and cooperation, in accordance with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. The normalization of coercion and threats of regime change undermines the integrity of the entire international legal order. A further element of concern has been the increasing use of judicial and political actions against senior Cuban leaders as part of the broader campaign or pressure against Cuba in order to justify further unilateral coercive measures and aggression, which constitutes an abuse of process that violates the principles of sovereign equality and self-determination under the UN Charter. The Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations reiterates their unwavering solidarity with the people and government of the Republic of Cuba and calls upon the international community to firmly reject any act of aggression, to reiterate the call of the General Assembly of the United Nations to lift economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the government of the United States of America against the Republic of Cuba, to remove Cuba from arbitrary and unilateral list of state sponsors of terrorism, and to uphold international law, multilateralism, and the respect for the Charter of the United Nations in its entirety and interconnectedness. Every day, the blockade continues to exist represents a shame on the moral authority of this organization, a shame on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and a shame for multilateralism itself. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Eritrea. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement at this UNGA debate on Agenda Item 38 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba on behalf of the member states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Mr. President, you would recall that during the last General Assembly debate on this agenda item at the 88th United Nations General Assembly session held on 28-29 October 2025, the OIC group had made a passionate call for lifting of the economic, commercial and financial embargo which has remained in force for 6 decades. This renewed call is necessitated by the recent developments which have manifested in the contemplated tightening of the embargo. Arising from the urgency to address the dire humanitarian situation posed by these measures, and in line with the sacrosanct principles of the international law, as advanced in the past resolutions adopted by the Assembly, the OIC Group reiterates its support for an immediate end to the series of measures imposed on Cuba. To this end, we consider any attempt to tightening of sanctions against the people of Cuba as a negation of the principles and purposes of the United Nations and promotion of friendly relations among states, including the socio-economic well-being of their peoples. In this regard, it is regrettable that despite the overwhelming message sent by members of the United Nations General Assembly on the previous occasions, additional measures are being contemplated with a view to tightening the series of economic and military measures against the state and people of Cuba. It bears repeating that the embargo has not only affected Cuba's commercial sector and national economic activities, but has also had disastrous humanitarian consequences on the whole Cuban population. This policy has continued to hinder the ability of other countries to invest in and trade with Cuba because of extraterritorial effects. The OIC Group is particularly concerned about the extent to which the impacts of the embargo have increased exponentially. Due to these measures, banking operations as well as financial operations have become extremely difficult for the people of Cuba, thereby impeding Cuba's efforts to insert itself in the global supply chain. We again call for lifting of the financial embargo against Cuba, which has adversely affected the level and quantum of its socio-economic cooperation with its traditional partners in the global south, particularly within the developing countries. Most unfortunately, the embargo has a notable impact on the national health system, which is reflected in the difficulties encountered by the national industry in purchasing the materials needed to preserve food and produce medicines and other products. These restrictions have also reduced the level of international assistance from Cuba to other developing countries in the area of health and human capital development. Mr. President, as we join the clarion call for an end to the extant embargo against Cuba, we note that these economic and other measures represent an obstacle to the aspirations of its people to achieving the sustainable development goals and the commitments under the Pact for the Future. Accordingly, the OIC Group strongly supports the renewed call for the removal of the embargo while urging non-introduction of any additional measures that will be inimical to the welfare of the people of Cuba and the territorial integrity of its states. I thank you all.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Haiti on behalf of the Caribbean community.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. We welcome the distinguished presence of His Excellency, Mr. Bruno Eduardo Rodriguez Parilla, Foreign Affairs Minister of the Republic of Cuba, at this important plenary meeting. President, CARICOM has taken note of the current situation in Cuba, and we are extremely concerned at the worsening of the social and economic conditions feeding into a humanitarian crisis. We underscore that the needs of the civilian population must remain the highest priority, and we call for the adoption of measures to improve the situation. The General Assembly has previously demonstrated with an overwhelming majority its support for taking into account the humanitarian and developmental needs of the Cuban people. And it is regrettable that as we meet here today in this Assembly, this situation continues. The effects of this situation over time necessarily is a source of concern for the whole region. The Caribbean area is united by geography, history, common vulnerabilities, as well as by a long-standing spirit of solidarity and cooperation. And we must also think about our CARICOM citizens working and living in Cuba after years of active cooperation. In this context, we reaffirm the principle according to which the Caribbean must be an area free of war and conflict. The member nations of the Caribbean community are fervent defenders of multilateralism, as well as the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, as well as international law. We always advocate for developing friendly relations between states, and it's in that spirit that we remain convinced that the challenges that Cuba is facing cannot be solved other than through constructive dialogue and peaceful involvement. And we welcome the recent discussions between the parties, and we call upon them to pursue those talks in good faith with a sense of urgency as the most effective way to overcome differences and alleviate the suffering of the Cuban people. CARICOM also respectfully calls upon the Cuban authorities to implement measures that will contribute to alleviating the difficulties that the Cuban people are facing. CARICOM is participating in today's debate as a long-standing friend of Cuba and of the United States, and we are prepared to play a role to bring the parties together. So we continue to call for normalization of relations between these two friendly countries in the interests of the entire region. CARICOM reiterates its call for pursuing constructive dialogue and engagement between the two parties concerned. That is the most effective way to promote mutual cooperation and promote solutions that will be for the well-being of the Cuban people. We therefore call upon the parties to ensure that the path of dialogue always remains open. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Haiti. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of the EU and its member states.
Thank you, President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union's member states. The candidate countries Montenegro, Albania, the Republic of Moldova, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Norway, Andorra, and San Marino, and the United Kingdom, align themselves with this statement. President, today's debate is about the U.S.'s economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. The European Union acknowledges the adverse humanitarian impact these measures have on the Cuban people and reaffirms the UN Charter as the guiding framework. At a moment where Cubans are facing increasingly dire conditions, we believe that humanitarian support and access must be protected under all circumstances. President, the dire situation of the Cuban people is not due only to the embargo. Meaningful political and economic reforms by the Cuban authorities are urgently needed. These reforms should include the full respect for the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Cuban people, and the release of all individuals who have been arbitrarily detained. Moreover, the European Union urges the Cuban authorities to make concrete advances towards opening spaces for a constructive and inclusive dialogue with civil society. While reaffirming the importance of respecting international law in all contexts, we deeply regret that Cuba's position on Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine has not been consistent with the principles of the UN Charter. This was exemplified most recently by its vote against the 24 February resolution on support for a ceasefire and lasting peace in Ukraine. In this context, the EU urges Cuba to refrain from providing any support to Russia's aggression and to take all necessary and effective measures to prevent its nationals from joining Russian military forces involved in the war. President, U.S. extraterritorial measures against Cuba negatively affect EU economic interests as well and violate commonly accepted rules of international trade. In order to protect the interests of natural or legal persons residing in the EU against the extraterritorial application of the Helms-Burton Act, EU law forbids our member states from implementing that legislation. Some aligned countries also have retained blocking legislation in their own jurisdictions. The EU reaffirms its support to dialogue and a diplomatic solution between the United States and Cuba, grounded in international law, including the principles of the UN Charter. Colleagues, millions of Cubans today face daily power outages, shortages of medicines and food, collapsing public services, and growing difficulties in assessing even the most basic health care. Hospitals struggle to function. Families spend hours searching for fuel, transport, or essential products. Cubans want a better life. They aspire to freedom and opportunity and deserve a brighter future. The EU will continue its critical yet constructive engagement with Cuba to support the country's institutional, economic, social, and political modernization. We stand ready to share our experience. We will also continue to support the Cuban population with humanitarian assistance to address its urgent needs. But let us be equally clear, humanitarian support alone will not solve Cuba's crisis. Important sovereign decisions can no longer be postponed. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali on behalf of the African Group.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the African Group at this reconvened plenary called to decide on the reopening of Agenda Item 38 and the holding of an additional debate on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. The situation has worsened gravely since the adoption of Resolution A/AD/6L on 29 October 2025. On that day, for the 33rd consecutive year, an overwhelming majority of this Assembly, 165 member states, called once more for the embargo to be brought to an end. That call has not been heeded. It had been answered instead by tightening of the very measures of the this Assembly has rejected for more than 3 decades. Mr. President, on 29 January 2026, a new executive order declared a national emergency and authorized tariffs against any state supplying oil or fuel to Cuba. This reaches well beyond the long-standing embargo and move it toward a globalized fuel blockade, drawing third states into enforcement of a policy that this body has condemned year after year. United Nations human rights expert has described the order as a serious breach of international law, and the Secretary General has warned of a possible humanitarian collapse while urging dialogue and respect for international law and international humanitarian law. The African Group shares that alarm. The shortage of fuel has brought prolonged blackout across the island, has placed hospitals under emergency conditions, and has disrupted education, food production, and transport, with a heaviest burden borne by the most vulnerable. The African Group called for the full respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Republic of Cuba and recalled the obligation of all states to refrain from the threat or use of force, to settle their dispute by peaceful means, and to abstain from intervention on matters within the domestic jurisdiction of any other state. No difference between two states can justify the collective punishment of an entire people, still less any measure that places the life and well-being of its population in jeopardy. Mr. President, our solidarity remains on enduring ties. At the 39th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of the African Union, held in February 2026, our head of state and government reiterated for the 17th consecutive year their full call for the lifting of the sanctions imposed on the people and the government of Cuba. That designation bears no relation to Cuba cooperation has extended to Africa across decades. The African Group called again for the repeal of the extraterritorial provisions of the Helm-Barton Act, in particular its Title III, which remain the most principal obstacle to Cuba's pursuit to 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The African Group reiterates support to the reopening of this item and welcome a further debate so that the Assembly may speak again and speak clearly. We call for the lifting of the measure imposed on Cuba on 29 January 2026. For its part, the African Group will remain firm in its principled positions, solidarity with Cuba, its people and government. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mali, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, thank you. Mr. President, there's a lot of talk today of an embargo, and indeed there is one. It's staring us all in the face. It's the embargo the Cuban regime mercilessly imposes on its own people decade after decade after decade. As we meet again, yet again, today, sadly, Cuba is plunged back into darkness. Another blackout is sweeping the island. Blackouts have been affecting the island for many, many years. Colleagues, this is sadly nothing new. Families are once again wondering whether their food will spoil, whether hospitals will have power, whether they will have enough charge on their phones to call their loved ones. But somehow, conveniently, there always seems to be enough power for the regime, for the Cuban dictatorship. There's enough power right now as we speak for the Castro family's compounds. They have electricity. There's enough power for the regime's offices, including, apparently, enough to type up today's remarks, blaming America once again, year after year, for the crisis they have created. There will be, I promise you, enough power for the Cuban propaganda shop to clip and post and translate their lies they're spreading in this body once again around the world. I stand here today to urge the Cuban regime, change your ways, turn the lights back on for your people. You have heard the cry of your own people. Answer it. Answer that cry. Che Guevara, one of the heroes of the regime, otherwise known as the Butcher of La Cabón, who, oh, by the way, rounded up gay people and sent them to labor camps, he used to say that Cuba's revolutionaries were, quote, guided by love for their people. Where is that love? I don't see that love. 5 years ago, this month, 5 years ago, on July 11th, 2021, thousands of Cubans filled the streets and demanded freedom. You can pound away, my friend. This is not Havana. This is the United States of America. This is the United Nations. And we will speak, we will be heard, and we will not be silenced like your own people. So pound away.
I'm sorry to interrupt the speaker. This is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. Before giving the floor, may I remind the distinguished representative of Cuba that in pursuant to Rule 71, a representative raising to a point of order may not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba on a point of order.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I call for you to call to decorum the permanent representative of the United States. This is the United Nations General Assembly. You are a liar, Mr. Waltz.
Your remarks will be reflected in the record of this meeting. I also appeal to members to conform with the practice of the United Nations whereby debates are conducted in a respectful manner. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States of America to continue.
Mr. President, here's what the regime and their very rude and inappropriate representatives do not want you to hear. That 5 years ago, this month, this anniversary is coming up, thousands of their people filled the streets of Cuba and demanded their freedom. They were hungry, they were tired, they are living through years of blackouts. They are sick of a regime that sits on billions while its people starve. For 67 years, the Cuban regime has enriched itself, its ruling elites, while abusing its people, strangling private enterprise, criminalizing dissent, and clinging to failed communist economics. Colleagues, communism has never worked, it doesn't work, and it will not work. And when the Cuban people demanded something better, something different, to have a voice, the regime could choose to listen, but it did not. Instead, it chose to imprison 800 of its own people. And I want to take a moment today to read a few of their names. You should hear their names. You should see their faces. Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara. You know what his crime was? He's in maximum security prison. His crime, and this is according to the regime, is, quote, artistic expression. His crime is being an artist, Mr. President. Fernando Almendares Rivera. His crime, he's a musician, and he writes songs the regime doesn't like, calling for freedom. Michael Castillo Perez, another musician in maximum security prison. What did he do? He also wrote rap songs the regime doesn't like. This young man, this amazing young man, Duanes de Bel Leon Tobera, is a young poet. He's a poet. Security prison. And these two brothers, Jorge Martin, Nadir Martin Perdomo, the UN, you all, have condemned their imprisonment and called for their release. See their faces as you make your speeches today. Remember them, because they're in prison for daring for freedom. Colleagues, they're not armed, they're not violent, they carry flowers and write poems and write music. And for that, the regime beats them, detains them, and tries to break them. These are the names the delegation here banging on the table doesn't want you to hear. They don't want this assembly to hear it. They don't like free speech. They don't like dissent. And instead, year after year, they hide behind this myth called a blockade. But let's talk about this so-called blockade. I would ask you if there's an embargo, and I'm looking at some of the delegations here. If there's an embargo, a blockade, whatever name they want to put on it, how did humanitarian aid from Belize, Canada, Chile, China, Colombia, the European Union, Mexico, Spain, Russia, Uruguay, and the UN itself reach the country just in the last few months? Many of you have mentioned a massive Russian oil tanker with 750,000 barrels of oil just went to the island. There's a humanitarian aid provision in our law for humanitarian aid. There is no ring of Navy warships, U.S. Navy warships, sitting around this island blocking trade or humanitarian aid going into Cuba. It's fake, it's false, it's a lie. Period. If there's an embargo, why does the United States, I'm a native Floridian, I've seen the ships leaving our ports, give $500 million a year in commodities to Cuba? Why is the U.S. providing more than $100 million in aid? I've heard other countries giving aid today, spread over a decade, a few $1 million, $100 million just this year in aid. Also working with the Vatican and the Catholic Church to deliver food and medicine to the needy. Aid that we also provided, additional aid after the most recent hurricane. And I ask you, I go back to the fundamental question. If there's no food and fuel for hospitals, how is there fuel for the Castro private family jet? How does President Diaz-Canel afford, you can look it up online, his Hermes tie? How does he afford his Rolex watch and the Mont Blanc pen that he writes with? How does the Castro family afford their 17 homes, their private island, their splashy trips to Madrid and Moscow and the Costa del Sol?
I'm sorry to interrupt the speaker once again. There is a point of order from the delegation of Cuba. But let me just remind the delegation of Cuba and all delegations, in fact, a delegation can exercise the right of reply at the end of this of the afternoon meeting. So I will give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba if he has a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is a procedural matter. The delegation which opposed and asked for this debate to not take place has taken the floor twice, and it is doing so now in an offensive way against my country, and I call upon you to call upon the Speaker to observe decorum. Thank you.
Your remarks will be reflected on the record of this meeting. I also appeal to members to conform to the practice of the United Nations whereby debates are conducted in a respectful manner. So please continue.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I just will have to say as an aside that the truth hurts and the truth isn't disrespectful. I'm sorry you don't want to hear it, the delegation from Cuba. But here's the part, colleagues, they're really not going to want to hear. This is an organization called GAISA. This is the Cuban military's secretive conglomerate that runs about half the Cuban economy. It has an $18 billion trust fund. I would hope you would all ask yourselves, particularly those that are contributing, where's all the money going? Where is all of that money, $18 billion under GAISA? If you haven't heard of it, it doesn't give a cent of those earnings to the Cuban people. We should also be talking about Cuba's modern-day slave trade. Yes, the Cuban regime ships doctors and nurses around the world and around the region, but here's the part they don't tell you, and they want to bang the table so that you don't hear. The regime takes their wages. They don't get paid. The regime takes the wages and makes them work for free and threatens their families if they disobey. And they do the same with the mercenaries. My European colleagues, please hear this. Thousands of Cuban men are being forced to fight in Ukraine. And do you know where their wages are going? In the Castro family pockets. They're going to the regime. So I question how you can stand here as you take the position that you've taken on Ukraine and not condemn the Cuban regime for sending mercenaries there. It is no wonder, with what I've laid out today, that nearly 2 million Cubans have risked their lives and fled. And where do they flee? They often go to the United States. We have now 3 million Cuban Americans who are proudly thriving as entrepreneurs, as business owners, as lawyers, as doctors, as members of their communities. Even our own Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a Cuban American who has risen through our society to represent the United States on the world stage. In contrast, Cuban Christians have been persecuted. Dissidents are sent to labor camps, Afro-Cubans are rounded up, and anyone who speaks out pays the ultimate price. So we have to ask ourselves, why does Cuba continue to call for this debate and come to this microphone? The answer is simple, because blaming the United States is the only economic plan Havana has left. And when they try to whitewash their crimes, again, for the second time in one session at the cost of $28,000 per hour, don't fall for it. Don't lend your voice to this propaganda. There is no American blockade. The only embargo in Cuba is the guillotine the regime keeps over the heads of its people. And when the Cuban regime keeps feeding their people in the world these lies, they would do well to remember Fidel Castro's own words. He said, quote, "Deceiving the people, raising false hopes, always brings the worst consequences." Well, the consequences are being felt by the Cuban people year after year after year. And what are those consequences? They are years of blackouts, a population that hates its government, empty grocery shelves, broken hospitals, and millions of Cubans who have fled the island that they love. I ask you again, we heard the foreign minister of Cuba describe the United States as racist and oppressive. Why are so many people trying to come to this country? Why are so many people fleeing their country? The world should not help the Cuban regime hide its incompetence and its malice and its corruption and its greed. We should help the Cuban people break free, realize the freedoms that the Cuban people have dreamt of for so long. I stand with the Cuban people. President Trump stands with the Cuban people. Secretary Marco Rubio, a proud Cuban American, stands with the Cuban people. We call on the regime to release these political prisoners, to allow real economic freedom, and give the Cuban people the very rights that this body claims to defend. Stand with the Cuban people. Do not stand with the regime that has broken that country. You cannot do both. Now is a time for choosing. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States of America. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Particularly warm greetings to Comrade Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, to whom we express our fraternal embrace of solidarity and respect. We align ourselves with these statements by the representatives of Uruguay on behalf of the G77 and China, Uganda of the Non-Aligned Movement, and Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. Mr. President, on behalf of the people and government of Reconciliation and National Unity, we reiterate our absolute and invariable support for the people and government of the Sister Republic of Cuba, to President Miguel Díaz-Canel, to General of the Army Raúl Castro, to the Communist Party of Cuba, and to the historic leadership of the Cuban Revolution, heir to the immortal thought of José Martí, Fidel Castro, and all those heroes and martyrs of that revolution that lives forever in dignity, solidarity, and victory. Mr. President, Nicaragua has always categorically and robustly condemned the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the government of the United States against Cuba. The international community every year has expressed the idea that this anachronistic, unjust, illegal, and inhumane policy constitutes a flagrant violation of the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, of international law, and of the right to development. We also condemn the increase in the intensity of extraterritorial measures, financial persecution, the energy blockade, and all actions aimed at suffocating an entire people simply for defending their independence and their right to self-determination and to freely decide their own destiny. The blockade against Cuba has become an economic, financial, energy, media and political war imposed against the Cuban people, the systematic aggravation of which has taken the form of the collective punishment of a dignified and heroic nation. By depriving the people of Cuba of food, medicines, electricity, fuel, transport, financing, and legitimate opportunities to exercise their right to development, we see an attempt to shake the will, to break the will of a people who for more than 6 decades has proven to the world their high values of dignity. The current moment is particularly serious. Cuba is facing an unprecedented uptick in this blockade. Actions designed to block the supply of fuel and to hinder legitimate economic relations with third states have had a direct impact on power generation, essential public services, the production of food, transport, the operation of hospitals, education, and the daily lives of millions of Cubans. When a country is deliberately deprived of the essential resources it needs to guarantee electricity, health, food, and basic services, this constitutes an attack on the life, stability, peace, and well-being of an entire people. Mr. President, Nicaragua also denounces the threats, the possibility of military aggression against Cuba, and we reject any threat or use of force against the Republic of Cuba. Cuba is not a threat to anyone. Cuba is saving lives, training doctors, sharing science, culture, education, healthcare, and solidarity-based cooperation with the peoples of the South, of the global South. Cuba has been and remains a moral, cultural, scientific power and a power of solidarity. Threatening Cuba means threatening the peace of Latin America and the Caribbean. Any military action against Cuba would have extremely serious consequences for regional and international stability and would constitute a direct violation of the proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. Our Latin America and the Caribbean, a zone of peace, demands dialogue, cooperation, mutual respect, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and the full recognition of the sovereign equality of all states. We call upon the international community to act with responsibility, to reject any escalation of aggression, and to defend the right of the peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean to live in peace, security, stability, and dignity. Mr. President, Nicaragua reiterates that that differences between states need to be resolved through dialogue, diplomacy, and full respect for international law. Each year, this General Assembly pronounces itself overwhelmingly in favor of the end of the blockade. It is essential that there be full compliance with the resolutions of the General Assembly, which call for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. The immediate, total, and unconditional lifting of that blockade, the cessation of all unilateral coercive measures, as well as secondary and extraterritorial ones, and full respect for Cuba's right to trade, to develop, to grow, and to live in peace. Cuba should also be immediately removed from that unilateral, arbitrary, and illegitimate list of supposed state sponsors of terrorism. Mr. President, from our Nicaragua, the Nicaragua of Darío and Sandino, from our blessed, sovereign, Christian, socialist, solidarity-based, and always free Nicaragua, we reaffirm our eternal brotherhood with Cuba, a brotherhood that has been forged through struggles, shared ideals, mutual respect, and defense for sovereignty and self-determination. Because of the aforementioned, Nicaragua reiterates its call for respect for Cuba, for the definitive rejection of all threat, pressure, or attempt at aggression against our brotherly Latin American and Caribbean country. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
President, China aligns itself with the statements made by Uruguay on behalf of G77 and China, and by Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in defense of the UN Charter. China supports the convening of this debate by the General Assembly and voted in favor of the proposal to hold the debate. Just now, the fact that 136 states have voted in favor fully testifies to the prevailing will of the international community and its clarion call for justice. For over 6 decades, the United States has persistently imposed illegal economic embargo and unilateral sanctions against Cuba. Visiting an immense catastrophe on the country and its people, Cuba has suffered cumulative losses exceeding $170 billion, a full spectrum of facilities vital to the national development and people's well-being, such as hospitals, schools, water supply, and grain storage, are under huge strain. Fuel supplies are critically short. The electricity and energy crisis is worsening. Access to essential goods like medicines and medical equipment remains blocked. And vulnerable groups, including children and pregnant women, are severely affected. Since the beginning of this year, the United States has doubled down and further escalated its containment, suppression, blockade, and threats against Cuba. It has adopted maximum measures in the energy, financial, and trade sectors, aggressively implemented extraterritorial secondary sanctions, threatened to sanction foreign entities and financial institutions doing business with specific Cuban entities, blatantly designated Cuban leaders, and even resorted to military threats against Cuba. Last October, the GA, by an overwhelming majority of 165 votes in favor, adopted the resolution titled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba for the 33rd consecutive year. The resolution urges all states to abide by the UN Charter and norms of international law and to reverse or repeal any laws or measures whose extraterritorial effects infringe upon the sovereignty of other states and the legitimate rights and interests of entities and individuals within their jurisdictions, or impede the freedom of trade and navigation. This resolution provides the basis for the immediate lifting of illegal sanctions against Cuba and must be strictly implemented. The actions of the United States seriously violate the provisions of the UN Charter regarding sovereign equality, the peaceful settlement of international disputes, and the prohibition of the use or threat of force. They flagrantly disregard UN GA resolutions, severely undermine the Cuban people's rights to life and development, and grossly trample upon the international order based on international law and the basic norms governing international relations. These actions must cease immediately. China urges the United States to immediately end its blockade and any and all forms of coercion and pressure against Cuba, stop infringing upon the Cuban people's rights to life and development, and refrain from setting itself against international consensus, history and justice, and the conscience of humanity. President, in the world today, profound changes unseen in a century are unfolding at a faster pace, and the international landscape is fraught with turbulence and disorder. Hegemonism and unilateralism are resurging. Progress in implementing the 2030 Agenda falls woefully short of expectations, and the UN-centered international system faces unprecedented shocks and challenges. Yet the prevailing trend of the times, with nations calling for fairness and justice, yearning for solidarity and cooperation, and aspiring to peace and stability, remains unchanged. The international community must unite to support Cuba's just struggle to defend its sovereign equality and national dignity, jointly resist illegal blockades, sanctions, and military threats, and safeguard world peace and stability. First, we must firmly uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We must renew our commitment to the purposes of the Charter, champion what it stands for in spirit, and make common cause in abiding by and acting on its provisions. We must uphold sovereign equality and oppose interference in internal affairs. And we must stay committed to the peaceful settlement of disputes and oppose the use of war. Any military adventurism will only push the region towards a precipice of uncertainty. The conflicts in the Middle East continue to spill over across borders, dealing a huge blow to regional and global peace and stability. We need not look far for a lesson and must not allow past failures to happen again. Second, we must firmly oppose all illegal unilateral sanctions. Unilateral sanctions without authorization by the UN Security Council have no basis in international law and jeopardize the sovereignty and security of other states. The international community must rally around to safeguard the Cuban people's rights to life and development, urge the relevant country to implement UNGA resolutions, and immediately terminate all forms of sanctions and secondary sanctions against Cuba. The act of threatening sanctions at every turn must not be condoned, and the Cuban people's right to pursue a better life must be guaranteed. Third, we must resolutely uphold international fairness and justice. Fairness and justice at the international level are vital to the survival and development of all nations. Hegemonism and power politics will spare no country. In today's world, no single country can act as the international police, nor can any country make itself out to be the international judge. We must join forces to safeguard the UN-centered international system and the international order based on international law, support the Cuban people in exploring a development path suited to their national conditions, upholding national sovereignty and dignity, and opposing external interference. Fourth, we must stand firm in solidarity and help one another in times of need. The nations of the world exist in a community with a shared future, and peace and stability in Cuba will have a bearing on the peace and development in the region and the world at large. The Chinese people deeply empathize with the hardships faced by the Cuban people and will continue to provide support and assistance to Cuba to the best of our ability. Member states, UN agencies, and other actors should make concerted efforts to step up humanitarian aid to Cuba, address shortages of fuel, food, medicines, and other supplies, help alleviate the crisis besetting the Cuban people, and uphold the fundamental principles of international humanitarianism. President, born from the ashes of the Second World War, the United Nations embodies humanity's reflection on history, its aspirations for justice, and the international community's moral compass in defending human dignity and peace. Under current circumstances, China stands ready to work with all member states to further deepen the reform of the UN and ensure the organization keeps pace with the times to improve international governance, to build a multipolar world that is equal and orderly, as well as an economic globalization that is beneficial and inclusive to all, and to uphold international fairness and justice. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of China. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Mr. President, Colombia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the G77 in China and the non-aligned movement, and we thank you for convening this meeting. My delegation reiterates our categoric rejection of the economic, commercial and financial blockade imposed on Cuba, and we express our full solidarity with the Cuban people in the light of the resurgence of unilateral coercive measures that continue to seriously affect the living conditions of the people. Colombia also rejects the application of secondary sanctions with extraterritorial effects. These measures are contrary to international law and the principles of the United Nations Charter. In particular, sovereign equality of states and the principle of non-intervention. Colombia recognizes the contribution that Cuba made to peace in Colombia and the region. The impact of the embargo has a huge human cost. The energy crisis that Cuba is going through is being made worse by lack of access to fuel. That has affected electricity production, transport, and essential services such as health and provision of food and water supply, education, and making it difficult to provide humanitarian assistance as the country continues to face the effects of Hurricane Melissa and also dealing with extreme climate change events. Colombia has accompanied Cuba not only with words but also through actions. In the last year, we've provided humanitarian assistance through air and maritime means, medications as well, hospital equipment, electrical equipment, solar panels, as well as resources aimed to support the immediate humanitarian response. The resurgence of the situation has affected essential health services, restricting access to medication and essential treatments, and affecting public health indicators. Only those in situations of greater vulnerability, children, nursing mothers, the elderly, and those with chronic diseases, complicated diseases, continue to suffer particularly from these restrictions. Colombia joins in repeated calls of this General Assembly in its resolutions for a lifting of the economic and financial blockade against Cuba, as well as putting an end to the secondary extraterritorial sanctions. More than ever before, Latin America must reaffirm itself as a zone of peace, a region that speaks with one voice to defend multilateralism, dialogue between the parties, and the self-determination of peoples, and respect for international law. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Mr. President, Angola warmly welcomes His Excellency Mr. Bruno Eduardo Rodrigues Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba, to this plenary meeting. His presence today reflects Cuba's continued engagement with multilateral diplomacy and commitment to dialogue, cooperation, and the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Angola aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the regional and political groups to which it belongs, and reiterates its concerns regarding the continued economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba. For more than 6 decades, these measures have adversely affected Cuba's economic and social development by limiting access to trade, investment, financing, technology, and essential goods and services. Their impact continues to be felt most acutely by Cuban people, with implications for sustainable development and the achievement of sustainable development goals. Mr. President, Angola reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the purpose and principle of the Charter of the United Nations, particularly sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs of states, respect for international law, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. We remain convinced that lasting difference between states can only be resolved through dialogue, mutual respect, and constructive engagement, rather than through prolonged unilateral measures that carry humanitarian and development consequences. We also remain concerned by extraterritorial effects of certain restrictive measures, particularly in banking and financial sector, which may affect third countries, private entities, and legitimate commercial transactions. Such measures undermine international economic cooperation, create uncertainty for international partners, and place additional constraints on development prospects of many developing countries. Mr. President, Cuba has made significant contribution to health, education, technical assistance, and capacity building in numerous developing countries, including in Angola. This lasting cooperation stands as a tangible example of the value of international solidarity and South-South cooperation in advancing sustainable development and improving the well-being of our peoples. Angola therefore reiterates that progressive easing and eventual lifting of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo would contribute to a more conducive environment for dialogue, confidence building, and mutually beneficial cooperation. It would also facilitate Cuba's fuller participation in the international economy to the benefit of regional stability, sustainable development, and international cooperation. Angola reaffirmed the central role of the General Assembly in upholding international law, promoting dialogue, and addressing measures that impede sustainable development and human welfare. We encourage the United States of America and the Republic of Cuba to continue strengthening bilateral dialogue, expand areas of practical cooperation, and pursue mutually acceptable solutions through diplomacy and constructive engagement. Angola will continue to support all initiatives aimed at reducing tensions, removing obstacles to sustainable development, and reinforcing multilateralism as the most effective framework for addressing international challenges and fostering peaceful relations among nations. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Angola. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Laos People's Republic, Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, my delegation allies itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the Group of 77 and China, the Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, the non-aligned movements, and the Group of Friends in defense of the Charter of the United Nations. We welcome the presence of His Excellency Foreign Minister Eduardo Rodriguez Parilla of Cuba at this meeting, and thank him for the update on the latest developments. We also thank Mr. President for the convening of this meeting. Mr. President, the Lao PDR reiterates its views that unilateral coercive measures are contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and the international law. They impede sustainable development, constrain international cooperation, and impose undue hardship on innocent people. The prolonged embargo imposed against Cuba, which has remained in place for more than 6 decades, runs counter to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the well-established norms of international law. It has inflicted significant socio-economic hardship on the ordinary Cuban people, including the latest disruptions to fuel, energy, food, medicine, and water supplies, and also undermine their legitimate right to development, sovereignty, and self-determination. The Lao PDR reaffirms its unwavering solidarity with the people and the government of Cuba, and once again joins the international community in calling for ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba, and for the removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, as well as for the elimination of all unilateral coercive measures imposed on sovereign states. The Lao PDR supports for dialogue and diplomacy which are consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter as the only sustainable path to resolving differences peacefully. The Lao PDR also supports the resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against the Republic of Cuba, which reflects a clear expression of the collective will of the international community to advance a peaceful, equitable, and just international order for all nations, large and small. In conclusion, The law PDR calls upon all member states to renew our collective commitment to upholding the UN Charter, safeguarding sovereign equality of states, and promoting inclusive and sustainable development, and to ensure that the people of Cuba, like all peoples around the world, are afforded the opportunity to prosper and to determine their own future in accordance with their own aspirations. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the People's Republic, Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cape Verde.
Mr. President, Cabo Verde aligns itself with the statement delivered by the African Group, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the G77 and China, and wishes to add the following remarks in its national capacity. We welcome the reconvening of this plenary meeting at a time when the humanitarian and economic situation in Cuba has become even more acute. The developments since the adoption of the General Assembly's resolution last October only reinforce the urgency of the call repeatedly made by this Assembly. For more than 3 decades, the overwhelming majority of member states have consistently affirmed that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba should be brought to an end. Cabo Verde has always stood with that majority and reaffirms today its principled and unwavering position in support of the immediate and unconditional lifting of the embargo. As a small island developing state, Cabo Verde is acutely aware of how external shocks, restricted access to markets, finance, and essential supplies can disproportionately affect vulnerable economies and, above all, the daily lives of ordinary people. Measures that aggravate humanitarian conditions and constrain a country's ability to pursue sustainable development are inconsistent with our collective commitment to the purpose and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Cabo Verde and Cuba continue to enjoy long-standing relations of friendship and cooperation, built on solidarity, mutual respect, and shared values. Cuba has made invaluable contributions to our national development, particularly in the areas of health, education, and human resource development. This enduring partnership further strengthens our conviction that dialogue, cooperation, and mutual respect are the appropriate path for addressing differences between states. We also reiterate our support for the removal of Cuba from unilateral listings that further restrict its access to international financial systems and undermine its economic recovery and development prospects. Mr. President, Cabo Verde remains firmly committed to multilateralism, international law, and the sovereign equality of states. We therefore support the reopening of this agenda item and join the international community in once again calling for the immediate end of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cabo Verde. We have heard the last speaker on the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. The meeting is adjourned.